March 1942, Berlin. Adolf Hitler calls Ferdinand Porsche into a meeting and gives him a contract. Build me a 100-ton tank. Porsche, who has just lost the production contract for the Tiger to Henschel and is looking for something to redeem himself, says yes. What follows is 2.5 years of engineering that produces the heaviest fully enclosed armored fighting vehicle ever built, a machine so enormous that a special railway wagon with 14 axles had to be designed just to move it across Germany, a machine so heavy that it could cross rivers only by submerging itself on the riverbed and driving across the bottom using a snorkel, a machine so wide that its tracks alone were 1.1 meters across each side, a machine that sank half a meter into the ground during trials on soft soil and still managed to steer itself out. It weighed 188 tons. By comparison, the Tiger II, the heaviest tank Germany actually deployed in combat, weighed 76 tons. The Maus was 2.5 Tiger IIs stacked on top of each other in everything that mattered. Only 2 hulls and 1 turret were ever completed. It never fired a shot in anger. When Soviet forces approached the testing ground at Kummersdorf in April 1945, the Germans destroyed one prototype themselves rather than let it fall intact into enemy hands. The other was captured and taken to the Soviet Tank Museum at Kubinka, where it sits today as a monument to the most spectacular waste of engineering talent the Second World War produced. Its name means mouse. The irony was apparently lost on everyone at the time. To understand why the Maus existed, you need to understand what was happening to Hitler's mind about tanks in 1942. The Tiger I had just entered production, 62 tons of steel that the Wehrmacht believed was invulnerable to anything the Allies could field. It was not invulnerable, as events in North Africa and on the Eastern Front would quickly demonstrate, but the psychological effect of fielding a tank that Soviet anti-tank guns struggled to kill was intoxicating to a leader who thought about weapons in terms of spectacle and dominance, rather than logistics and production numbers. If 62 tons was good, why not 80? Why not 100? The theoretical answer was always the same: a heavier tank is harder to kill. Hitler never fully grasped the practical answer. A heavier tank is also harder to fuel, harder to maintain, harder to transport, harder to bridge across rivers, harder to recover when it breaks down, and so slow that it presents a target for aircraft rather than a moving vehicle that must be tracked and engaged. He ordered the Maus anyway. He ordered it knowing it was impractical. His armaments minister Albert Speer and his tank generals told him it was impractical. An intense debate started when the wooden mock-up was shown, and except for Speer, all of those present found the Maus magnificent. Hitler approved mass production of 150 vehicles. He had seen a wooden model and ordered mass production of something that did not yet exist in steel. Ferdinand Porsche's solution to powering a 188-ton vehicle was the same solution he always reached for: electric drive. 2 Siemens direct current dynamos generating 720 kilowatts total powered the tracks through electric motors rather than a conventional gearbox. This was not as eccentric as it sounds. The system had advantages for a vehicle of this weight because it avoided the need for a mechanical transmission capable of handling the torque of the main engine, which would have been enormous and probably impossible to build reliably. The engine that drove the dynamos was initially a Daimler-Benz MB509, a 44.5-liter V12 derived from Germany's largest aircraft engine, the DB603. Later prototypes used a diesel variant, the MB517. The problem was not the concept but the execution. The engine and generator together occupied the entire central 2/3 of the hull, cutting the driver's compartment in the front off from direct internal access to the turret at the rear. If the driver needed to communicate with the turret crew, he could not walk through to them. The vehicle was also extraordinarily loud, extraordinarily thirsty, and extraordinarily slow. The design called for a maximum speed of 20 kilometers per hour. The best the prototype achieved on hard surfaces was 13. On soft ground, considerably less. The armament was genuinely terrifying, and one of the few aspects of the Maufis that lived up to its billing. The main gun was the Krupp 128mm Katowice 44L55, a weapon derived from the 12.8cm Pak 44 towed anti-tank gun, the heaviest anti-tank gun Germany produced in any quantity during the war. At combat ranges, this gun could defeat the armor of any Allied tank in existence with a standard armor-piercing round. The coaxial weapon was a 75mm Katowice 44, itself a gun that would have been the main armament of any tank in any army in 1939. A Maus carried 2 main guns by any previous standard of comparison. The turret armor was 220mm at the front, 200 at the sides and rear. The hull front was 200mm sloped at 35 degrees. The combined weight of turret and armor was so great that the turret alone weighed approximately 50 tons more than the entire weight of a T-34. Getting this thing onto the hull required a special crane. The only Maus turret ever completed was finished in July 1944 and fitted to the second hull in October. The testing told the story with merciless clarity. During the Maus VIII trials on January 15, 1944, the vehicle completed a 2-kilometer off-road trip demonstrating the accuracy of its steering. Despite its bulk, when the Maus moved across soft clay soil, it sank only half a meter into the ground, but only is doing a great deal of work in that sentence. A vehicle that sinks half a meter into the ground on soft clay cannot operate in the mud of the Eastern Front, where the Rasputitsa, the spring and autumn thaw periods turned roads into bottomless bog and stranded vehicles of a fraction of the Maus's weight for weeks. Germany was fighting most of its war in exactly this kind of terrain. In March 1944, the Maus became stuck in a very soft, swampy area on the testing ground. The implications were obvious and were ignored. The railway transport problem was equally intractable. A specialized railway transport wagon for heavy loads with 14 axles was required and was not allowed to pass through tunnels or over railway bridges. Moving a single Maus from one part of Germany to another required rerouting around every tunnel and bridge on the network, which in a country being systematically bombed by the Allied air forces meant the vehicle was essentially immobile at the strategic level. The river crossing solution, submerging on the riverbed and using a snorkel, was theoretical. No practical test of this capability was ever demonstrated with a complete vehicle. The Allied bombing campaign contributed significantly to the program's delays and ultimate failure. Krupp's production facilities in Essen were primary targets of the RAF's Battle of the Ruhr campaign in 1943. Delays in hull production cascaded into delays in assembly. By the time the second prototype was anywhere near completion in late 1944, the war's outcome was no longer in serious doubt. Germany had lost the initiative on every front. The Maus, which had been conceived as a weapon to break the Allied armored advantage on the Eastern Front, was now being considered for static defense roles, defending key headquarters installations and possibly plugging gaps in Germany's contracting perimeter. It was generally believed by Porsche that Hitler's true aim for the Maus was to field it in the more effective role of static defense along the Atlantic Wall, where its limited range and mobility would not have been as much of a hindrance, but this plan was thwarted by delays in production which pushed any possible delivery date well past D-Day. The end came in April 1945. Soviet forces were closing on the Kummersdorf proving ground south of Berlin. German engineers destroyed one of the prototypes. Accounts differ on which one and exactly how, rather than allow it to fall into Soviet hands intact. The surviving vehicle was captured by Soviet troops. The two prototypes were eventually brought together at Kubinka, where Soviet engineers combined the complete turret from the destroyed vehicle with the hull of the captured one, creating the composite vehicle that exists today. 5 units were ordered, but only 2 hulls and 1 turret were completed. The other 3 ordered hulls had been scrapped during the manufacturing process when it became clear the program was going nowhere. The Maus has attracted a dedicated following among military enthusiasts precisely because it represents the outer limit of what conventional tank design can achieve before it collapses under its own ambitions. Its specifications are genuinely impressive on paper. Its armament would have been lethal against anything it encountered. Its armor would have been extremely difficult to defeat with weapons of the era. And none of this matters because a tank that cannot move reliably, cannot cross bridges, cannot be transported strategically, cannot operate in mud, and was produced in a quantity of 2 is not a weapon. It is an engineering exercise with a very expensive price tag and a very prominent place in the Kubinka Museum. The Tiger II that Germany actually deployed killed Shermans and T-34s and changed the dynamics of individual engagements on the Eastern Front. The Maus never killed anything. It sank into the testing ground, got stuck in a swamp, was blown up by its own side, and ended up in a Soviet museum. The Maus that was supposed to terrify the world squeaked once at Kummersdorf and was never heard from again. The surviving composite vehicle sits in the Patriot Park Museum outside Moscow today, having been moved from Kubinka in 2017. It is 10.2 meters long, 3.71 meters wide, and 3.63 meters tall. It weighs 188 tons. You can walk around it and understand immediately why it exists and why it failed. It is too large. It is obviously too large. It was too large in 1942 when Hitler approved it from a wooden model. It was too large in 1944 when it got stuck in a swamp on the testing ground. It is too large now in a museum in Moscow where nobody is trying to drive it anywhere, and it still dominates every room it has ever been placed in. Ferdinand Porsche built it. Adolf Hitler wanted it. Albert Speer told them both it was a mistake. History sided with Speer. The heaviest tank ever built never fired a shot, never crossed a river, and never frightened anyone except the German engineers who had to figure out how to move it on a railway network designed for things that weighed less than a small house.